A very warm welcome tonight to the 8th event in the Presidential Lecture Series on Tech and the Human Future. Tonight, we are featuring the very well-known and much-loved duo of AUP teacher scholars, Claudia Roda and Susan Perry. Both are co-founders and directors of AUP's Master of Science in Data Science and Human Rights, about which I've spoken several times and which has debuted this year. And their students are amongst the participants in each of our discussions. As is no surprise to any of you at this point, and believe me, I am shorthanding this intro with every passing week, this series focuses on the impact of the rapidly expanding role of tech in human life. It takes up both the consequences of unregulated forces that can flatten and characterize groups of human beings, strip us of our liberties, not to mention violate what is left of human privacy. But the prodigious force and rapidity of technology advances can also change for the better many aspects of our lives. We've talked about safeguarding our human rights, greater protection of the environment, innovation in transportation, public health, agriculture, to name but a few examples. And tonight we're going to talk about education. So far in this series, speakers have addressed the use of AI in the preservation of work and the expansion of diversity and inclusion, the perpetuation of social injustice through bias, the creation of a more just society. So tonight, we're going to hear about AI and the transformation of education in the digital age. Susan Perry of AUP's Department of History and Politics and Claudia Roda of the Department of Computer Science, Math, and Environmental Science will explore the interplay between their two disciplines, that's really a plural because they both have multiple disciplines. Looking specifically at the impact of AI on the liberal arts. How do we render AI compatible with the liberal arts and prepare universities to create learning environments that are enhanced rather than diminished by excessive technology? Machine learning in society and the digital environment present threats to democracy, human rights, and human creativity, but they also present opportunities if placed within the correct frameworks. As always in the discussions after our lectures, we will be considering together and with our speakers our own responsibility for understanding and critiquing this role of technology in our lives. And as Susan and Claudia give their presentation, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. And of course, I will start with them as soon as we finish. A word on their biographies. So Susan Perry is a specialist in international human rights law and digital technology. She teaches law and politics at AUP and directs several of our graduate programs, both a scholar and an activist. Susan's work focuses on vulnerable populations, women and children and communities in conflict whose rights are being violated by the state, society, or industry, often in breach of legal binding conventions. Her most recent books analyze the nexus between digital technology, human rights, and deliberative democracy. Dr. Perry holds degrees from Brown University, the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, where she did her doctorate, and Oxford University. Claudia Roda is professor of computer science and global communication and the co-founder of the Technology and Cognition Lab and the Working Group on Human Rights and Digital Technology at AUP. Her research, which has been widely published and sponsored by numerous organizations, including the European Commission and the Andrew Mellon Foundation, focuses on the impact of digital tech on human behavior and social structure. Claudia holds degrees from the University of Pisa and the University of London, where she also worked at the first EU-sponsored research project on multi-agent systems. So thank you so much for coming to speak to us tonight with Susan and Claudia. We feel thrilled to be able to include you within the series. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Celeste. Thank you. I am going to be sharing my screen, and I encourage students and other colleagues and friends of AUP who have questions to put them in the chat. I'm going to share right away, and let me know. I think you should be able to see it. Is that correct? All right, so we're going to be talking about data science in higher education because that's something that Claudia Roda and I know. We feel comfortable discussing higher education, and we're very interested in how to use the transition towards AI as an opportunity for the liberal arts. So we'd like to begin by thanking President Schenck for including us in this really exciting lecture series. And we have learned a great deal from the colleagues who have preceded us, including Cedric Villani last week, of course, but Seth Farman in the very beginning, Margot, Bipin, Georgi, and Jessica Feldman, for example. So it's been very exciting for us to be included in this. Let me see, there we go. We'll be talking today about 5 things. First of all, our work, our research. Claudia will give an explanation of data science and AI and how it functions in the liberal arts. I'll be talking about mastering the toggle, which is something we believe is very important for liberal arts. Claudia will then talk about human attention in a digital environment. I'll be speaking about human rights in a digital environment. And then together, we're going to be talking about 5 principles for AI and the liberal arts, possibly at AUP. And so our work on human rights and digital technology has been going on for a good 12 years now. We published a book on human rights and digital technology with Palgrave. And what was interesting to us about this book was that the most frequently downloaded chapter from this book was our chapter on education. And people were very intrigued by the idea that we promoted the transmission of intellectual rigor in the classroom and that we were committed to the classroom in a liberal arts education. We've just recently published an article in the Oxford Journal of Human Rights Practice. This was a survey done with our students during COVID to better understand how they felt about online teaching. And we got quite a lot of interesting information from this survey, and it's just come out in a print version recently, and it's available. I'm going to turn the floor over to Claudia, who will be discussing our growing work in artificial intelligence.
So yes, an important part of our research is based on AI. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to try and give you a very personal chronology of AI. But I think that somehow it's representative of the evolution of the field and the problematic that we have been looking at. So I started working in AI in the 80s at the time when the distributed artificial intelligence was just coming about. And I was working at the first project that the EU sponsored on distributed AI. And these type of projects at that time were mostly based on rules. We were trying in a way to recreate human thinking and making system following a set of rules. And most of these systems were applied to industrial process control. In the 90s, there was a shift into trying to have AI application interact with the human beings. And that was a big change. Okay, so natural language processing came much earlier, and that was already a way of interacting with the human being. But this was try and bring the human into the picture, for example, in industrial process control, but in many other ways. And so things got much messier because humans are definitely not as predictable as an industrial process control system. And so we started figuring out that human thinking is not really based on rules, and it doesn't just happen in the brain. And so the way we were doing it wasn't really a good way to do it. And we started thinking how to include the human body, the sensory system, so that we would be able, in a way, to simulate that the human behavior and interact with the human in a better way. So it's at this point that in my personal career, but across lots of people started working on also human learning. And so working on another EU project where we were trying to help students learn by steering their attention, we started having really amazing results. It was really successful. Students will learn better when their attention was guided. But at the same time, we were collecting an incredible number of psychophysiological measures, I don't know, eye tracking, the speed of typing, and things like this. And so many of us started thinking about privacy, and in general, what happens when you manipulate human behavior with an AI system. And I guess we started become more aware of the fact that this type of system could be used for much less benevolent objectives, as we see nowadays. So this is where the collaboration between Susan Perry, who is an expert in human rights, and myself started trying to figure out how the human rights framework could ensure that technology is used in an ethical way, respecting human dignity. So we know that AI techniques nowadays are often used in the context of data science, and data science somehow is a larger field that we believe is of great interest for education in general, and in particular for the liberal arts. So what we're going to focus on is how is this relationship going to develop? Can you go to the next slide? So if we think of liberal arts, we can see that there are some objectives that are common and that have been recognized for quite a long time. First of all, we are looking to open student perspective, create a bridge across the humanity, the social sciences, the sciences, technology, and so on. And data science, in a way, it's very well adapted to this type of activities because data science always need a domain of application or several domains. And many of these discipline nowadays work with the use of data. So we have a methodological bridge, if you like, that connects all these different disciplines. On the other hand, we can also promote free thinking through critical analysis, because in a way, data science is founded in critical thinking, in evidence-based learning. And so the question of what is evidence is central to data science, and it's central to many disciplines. And it gets much more concrete when we start to represent what is true, what is the fact, what is the evidence, and so on. So each phase of data science may bring different problems and that we can study across different disciplines. And finally, using data science, we can encourage participation in civic life because we can give access to current reality that students can easily recognize and can address, and they can address problems that go from public health, social justice, climate change. So data science is really a methodology, a tool, and so they can use it in all these cases. And also, it allows us to see the ethical issues that are generated by data science and some AI methods, the issues of bias, the issues of trustworthiness, privacy, social scoring. We have heard about many of these. So data science can be, on one hand, a tool that allows us to explore different disciplines and can be applied to different disciplines. And another way, it can be an object that we can study. So I'm going to start from the latter, and then we're going to explore how we can, how can we use data science as a tool and AI as a tool, and what are the consequences? So yes, next slide. So if we look at data science as an object of study, we can recognize that it takes some input data about a specific domain, and then it generates on the other side some visualization, prediction, classification that allow us to make sense of that domain. The methods that we use, and what I'm trying to represent in that central part, is that data science is larger, and some of the methods used in data science are the methods of AI, and more specifically machine learning, and even more specifically deep learning. And we see that each of these methods has different, allows to do different things, but also give us different problems. And also we can see that things can go wrong in many different places. For example, we have input data that may be wrong or not representative of a certain population. many of you might have heard of a recent study that found that in driverless car, AI systems were built to be consistently better at identifying pedestrians with lighter skin tones than darker tones. Or another problem that we may have is that the model itself, the analysis that we do, can be based on wrong assumption, on biases, and so on. And here, an example that, again, you may have heard is the study by ProPublica of the North Point risk assessment tool for establishing the likelihood of repeated offense in criminal justice. And the study showed that Black people were almost twice as likely as white people to be labeled as higher risk, but actually not reoffend. So there are big problems here that need to be analyzed in building a system like this. Next, once we go to machine learning, we have even more possibility of going wrong. And because the problems may come up from the fact that the data change the model that we use. And so this is why we call them learning. And so we can have the system actually learn things that we don't particularly want the system to learn. And one good example of this is a chatbot called Type bot that was put on Twitter by Microsoft, and it was supposed to learn to interact with people. And it lasted on Twitter about 16 hours, and they had to take it down because it started posting highly offensive and sexist and racist tweets and comments. And Microsoft said, oh yes, but that's because a bunch of Twitter users came together to actually trick the bot into producing this type of speech. But obviously that's not what the AI was supposed to do. Something went wrong. And once we get into deep learning, we have the problem of lack of explainability. So not only the system may generate some really unwanted behavior, but we won't even be able to explain how it came about. So there are lots and lots of companies and researchers who are trying to look into this problem. Next slide. And here, what I'm showing you very just quickly so that you can see it is an example of a list that Microsoft made of failure modes in machine learning, in how many different ways machine learning may fail. And the one that I have highlighted there is about one specific study, but there are many more that could be mentioned, where the dosage of medicament was predicted wrongly for patients because of the data set wasn't the one that should have been. So definitely transparency is necessary for both security and to create trust in this algorithm. We need to make sure that they can be inspected and we know what they are doing. And so in a way, we see that data science and AI are really interesting object of study, and they can allow us to meet the objective of liberal arts education because they allow us to go across disciplines and bring up all these problems. The next question that we ask is whether they can also be tools that support liberal arts education in school like ours.
So, when we began teaching a course on human rights and digital technology, we've taught it about 5 times now. We've been very interested in what our students, who are in fact digital natives, had to say about technology. And one of the most striking quotes from this semester from students who I think are online at the moment, it was a group of 3 students working on AI and the liberal arts, and they simply said the liberal arts are not compatible with artificial intelligence. That was a really interesting statement. And of course, as a class, we began discussing why. Well, students told us that AI endangers the traditional liberal arts focus on teaching because you want to be taught by a human. You want human to human interaction. You don't want human to machine interaction. AI could also endanger the small classroom of the liberal arts institutions, meaning that if you could offer a course, almost like a MOOC, if you could use AI to teach thousands of students at a time, wouldn't that be more cost effective than a small classroom? And finally, and Claudia and I found this very interesting, our students thought that AI would probably threaten strong student governance, because the machine would come up with answers that would then not be debated. And students wanted to have an input, a say in what sort of technology would be used on campus and how it would be used. And we found that interesting. We think that the liberal arts could be compatible with artificial intelligence. And in our very last slide today, we'll explain to you how we think that's possible. So one of the questions that Claudia Roda and I have been asking ourselves for the past 12 years as we've been team teaching is, how do our students learn? And interestingly enough, we've come up with a term, the toggle. We've published on this. We believe that students need to be able to move between 3 different modes of expression seamlessly. We know that human learners are very skillful togglers. They have been since Homo sapiens started using tools. And we know that liberal arts universities are ideally placed to assist our students in mastering the oral tradition, which requires a different type of thinking and uses a different part of the human brain, and is the oldest tradition in the liberal arts. The written tradition, which came about with the advent of the printing press, was really developed during the Enlightenment, again, using a different part of the brain. And finally, the digital tradition, because this is now a tradition. We are 20 to 30 years into this revolution, at least in universities, with students using digital tools in the classroom. And they need to be able to move seamlessly between these 3 types of traditions. It should be, we believe, a hallmark of liberal arts education. And in fact, at AUP, we do talk about digital literacy. We have courses where this is emphasized, but we want to make sure that we take a holistic approach to this rather than just breaking off digital literacy as a separate tradition. We think it should be fully integrated with the oral and written traditions in a liberal arts institution. Now, we learned a lot during COVID. First of all, I'd actually like to thank Celeste for having guided us into this crisis. Our 3 days of workshops were kicking and screaming. The faculty learned to teach online. Were transformational for all of us. And we know that AUP did a terrific job in transitioning to online teaching, because that particular semester we were also teaching at Sciences Po because we were gathering comparative data for this article that you see on the left that we eventually wrote. And Sciences Po was so overwhelmed by the crisis that they shut down for a week while they thought about what to do. Then we also have a partnership with the Sorbonne, with Paris-Sorbonne, and their entire online teaching platform went down after 3 days and didn't go up again. And so consequently, AUP actually really mastered this toggle into the digital tradition. We learned how to teach online. We had our office hours online, all of our meetings online. And we discovered in the process that most universities are very ill adapted to the digital tradition already, and they are certainly unready to move towards AI. And what we suspect most universities will probably do in the coming 5 to 10 years is engage in piecemeal purchasing rather than have a holistic vision that's centered on student learning. And so one of the aspects that we really like to promote in terms of the liberal arts and liberal arts institutions is creating a holistic vision of exactly what the software is for and how we want to use it. Now, we did note one thing in this article that was recently published, and that student attention suffered online. Our students made that very clear. The results were sans appel, as we say in French. And I would like to ask Claudia to explain a bit more what happens to student attention in digital environments and why our students were so clear that their own attention suffered with online teaching. Claudia.
Yes, okay, so I'm going to look at a few things that also we have studied in a publication where several of the faculty at AUP have papers. And obviously, I will cover just a few items I think are particularly interesting when we talk about classroom environment. And so the book that you see on the right is the book edited by Wadik Dahl and myself. But here I want to concentrate on the work that we've done with Susan in what exactly happens in the classroom. So first of all, what we know is that we need attention. It's part of our way of being human. And in a way, I think we can reconnect it to what Margot Boeing-Lipsing a few weeks ago called recognition, when she was talking about the calculus of human worth and human dignity. So recognition is really important for us. And so there is something basic that drives us to try and get this attention, and we know that our attention is important to others. So this sets the basis to some of the behavior that we see. And one thing that is particularly important is the fragmentation of attention. So we know that attention is a form, this is this cognitive psychology that tells us that attention is mostly a form of selection. So we have too many stimuli coming to us from the outside world, and we need to select. And attention is the process that allows us to do that selection. The problem is that in going through this selection, more and more with the digital tool, we end up lacking the background. So we have points, we have information that is not connected. And some philosopher think that this lack of connection and our need for reconnecting things that we have attended, it could be the cause of the success of many conspiracy theory. So what happens is that this theory provide a very simple, even if it's purely fictional, explanation of fragmented pieces of information for which people want the explanation. So the fragmentation of attention has many consequences that go farther than just the fact that maybe in class you don't pay attention. So one different mode of attention that we may try to work with, which obviously is not adapted to all situations, is a more diffuse type of attention that is similar to the attention that we pay when we look at an object of art or when we listen to music. And this is so this diffusion allows us to keep more of the picture rather than extracting bits. Another problem is the fact that the ubiquitousness of our devices creates more and more possibility for interruption and fragmentation. And it's really interesting because one of our students commented that with these devices is as if friends could come into the classroom. And so it was much harder to keep the concentration. Another problem that we see is that the use of digital technology requires a different set of skills than is required from studying other things. So on top of studying the subject of study, we add the cognitive load related to dealing with technology. So then we have the final element that is attention, delegation, and trust. So what we see is that there is an increasing, with the use of data, there is an increasing use of metrics and hyper-personalization of information, preference matching, and somehow we delegate our choices to the tools that make that choices for us by, for example, personalizing certain results. And with this, our students have told us that also there is a shift in trust. Sometimes they trust more what the device tells them rather than what they know. And they gave us the example of using a Google map, and they saw the route on the Google map, and they knew that there would have been a better route to go somewhere, but it was easier just to follow that route suggested by the system. So how do we deal with this behavior in the classroom? So maybe you can go to the next one, please. So we think that there are a few things that we can do. We can work on two levels. First of all, we can adapt our curriculum to this fragmented attention and provide students with a smaller chunk of information. And at the same time, we do exactly the opposite. We train students in analytical flow thinking to counteract fragmentation, to try and extend their attention, maybe diffuse it a bit. And also one thing we need to do is to frame social uncertainty and teach resilience strategy, because they need to learn how to cope with the consequence of this fragmentation that I mentioned some of them before. And then we need to privilege the toggling. So we need to make sure that they move from the oral to the written to the digital, and they can use them interchangeably and one with the other. But overall, we think that what is really important is to have a focus on comparative reasoning rather than content which may be manipulated. So it's really difficult to decide what is manipulated and what is not. And depending who you ask to, different things are considered as manipulated. So what is bias and so on. And the only way in which you can cope with the situation that we currently have is actually stepping back and telling oneself that no matter what the first feeling you have is, you need to compare. So maybe I'll stop there and we can move on.
So the interesting thing about stepping back is it's really what liberal arts education is all about. It's stepping back, it's comparing, it's asking questions, it's listening to very diverse opinions, particularly in the AUP classroom. We're very interested in human rights in a digitized environment. And we want to point out that human rights and digital technology have grown apace since the Second World War. They began slowly. You had, of course, Alan Turing during World War II was doing really remarkable work. But you also have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was drafted in 45 and 46 and promulgated in 48. And so these two frameworks have grown up together through the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century. They are now both extremely complex. So one of the first things we want students to understand is that fragmented attention means vulnerability to AI manipulation. Our students need to be aware of this. They need to understand, they need to come to terms with their own definition of what it means to be human and what it means to be a machine. We also want AI to be placed in a human rights framework. Our students in advanced human rights law last fall, many of them are online right now, for their midterm exam, commented on the draft AIA, the Artificial Intelligence Act. They commented on the human rights shortcomings of the act because it's a risk-based approach that frames this act. And we sent many of these comments directly to the Parliamentary Committee of the EU, which is charged with ethical artificial intelligence. The General Data Protection Regulation, we want our students to know and understand their rights within that framework as well. We also want our students to know how to use AI tools within democracies, how to use AI to achieve good governance, but also how to use AI to contest undemocratic processes. What's really interesting right now is the war in Ukraine has demonstrated how one can use technology, and in some instances AI, to both call out cynical policy pronouncements on the part of Russia, for example, and also how to help communities organize and respond to this catastrophe. So our students have many concerns. And when we asked them to tell us what they were thinking about in terms of AI and the liberal arts institution, one of the first concerns that came up was privacy. Privacy is protected under Article 12 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 17 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. Students are very concerned about insufficient protection of personal and financial data, and they're concerned for a reason, because a year ago, between January and March 2021, 300 institutions in the United States had their data stolen by, via a software, Allianz, and this data was stolen. You had 150,000 cases of data theft, for example, at the University of Colorado. The University of California also had tens of thousands of data breaches. This data, students were then able to find it on the dark web. It had been sold. And so consequently, students everywhere are hoping that their data is sufficiently protected. I have to say, I think AUP is doing an excellent job, but it's something that students think about, and we should be aware of it. When we ask them about campus security, they all want to keep their old-fashioned ID card. Nobody in our classes seems to want biometric campus security, even though some biometric data can be stored, and some biometric data, the iris, the fingerprint, can be immediately deleted. Nonetheless, made our students nervous. And finally, several of them shared with us what it was like to take an online exam during COVID, an LSAT, where the software that accompanied the exam monitored eye movement, for example, could monitor directions in which students were turning to determine whether or not they might possibly be cheating. And this obviously spooked our students, something I don't think will happen in a liberal arts university, but it's possible, something to think about. Another area where our students were deeply concerned, in fact, they've just had a midterm on it, was censorship. Our students are concerned with internet censorship, and certainly we have examples in the United States, in France, and particularly in China. Claudia and I are much more concerned with self-censorship. We are worried that our students, through scoring, are beginning to censor their own behavior. Through their social media postings, we know everybody censors their behavior unless, like me, they don't post. Digitized personalization. When you download Netflix films, after a while, the choices that are going to appear on your screen each time you go in are honed towards your own taste. So you think you have a broad range of selection, but in fact you don't. And finally, new reading really concerns us. This is, let's say everybody would in the class would be assigned Thomas Piketty's Capitalism in the 21st Century. Using AI, every student could read a different version of that book that had been shaped to their reading style by artificial intelligence. I don't need to say that Professor Roda and I are opposed to that possibility, but students are interested and also worried about it. Finally, freedom from discrimination. This is Article 1 of the Universal Declaration. It's an integral part of all of the 9 human rights treaties. It's an integral part of national constitutions. We think about it all the time. AUP has a diversity committee that Celeste set up, and this is a core concern for liberal arts education. Students brought up some interesting points that we hadn't thought about. So in terms of access, we want everybody to have digital access. But if we buy very expensive AI software systems, students were concerned that their tuition might rise to pay for the software systems, and that consequently access to liberal arts education might become less possible for certain students. They wouldn't be able to pay. Also, in large universities, there's an increasing amount of human-to-machine interaction, and human-to-human interaction may become the privilege of expensive liberal arts universities. So it's not access to technology that concerned our students, it was access to humans, to human professors and administrators. Also, we're very aware of profiling. Claudia has already mentioned several examples of profiling. We know that if we use AI for online advising, if students do their advising with a machine, machines will begin to put students with lower GPAs into certain courses and students with higher GPAs into other courses. In other words, the machine will begin to make advising decisions with the students that may not be optimal, because maybe what you want are very mixed classrooms with very mixed student levels. And all of our students were steadfastly opposed to AI roommate selection. They thought that wasn't how they wanted this to be done. And so Claudia and I have 5 principles for artificial intelligence and its use in liberal arts universities. Claudia, why don't you begin?
Well, okay, so the first one is something which seems very simple, but it doesn't really, it isn't really applied all the time. So very often we use technology because we have technology or because it's cheap to use technology, but in fact, it doesn't give us a better result than not using technology. So for example, assisting the elderly, teaching a course and so on, is unlikely that an AI will do better than the human. So the idea is to use technology when it can assist the human to perform better, not when it's just cheaper or it's just there.
The second would be minimal use of artificial intelligence in the classroom to preserve the liberal arts tradition. Now, we don't think it's possible to have an AI-free classroom. Although we have smoke-free classrooms, maybe we could have AI-free classrooms. But we should think about how to organize classroom learning so that it focuses on the human and the human-to-human interaction. Claudia.
Then we have the fact that if we think in terms, for example, of the General Data Protection Regulation, when we look at the AI algorithm that are used in the class or within a university, the students are data subjects, so they should have an oversight over the choice that is made in the selection of this algorithm.
We'd also think that universities should commit to human oversight by design. So universities should only purchase AI software systems that commit to human oversight by design. They don't all do this, and it probably is going to be taken out of the Artificial Intelligence Act. So this will be on a voluntary basis. But we think it's very important that students know that the AI that they interact with has the possibility for human intervention. A human can intervene to evaluate how the AI is functioning. They can stop the AI. They can improve the trajectory of the AI. So human oversight by design. And Claudia.
And finally, something that it's in the current version of the AI recommendation of the EU. It may change, but it's certainly being implemented in other, for example, by the city of Amsterdam. The UK is also looking into this, which is creating a register of all the algorithms used to deliver education and student services. So in general, the registration into a database of algorithms that are used by an institution is a way in which anybody can go and verify how decisions are made. And also, obviously, along with the registration of the algorithms, there should be an explanation of the algorithm that is accessible to everybody. So this is our last one.
This is our last slide. We hope that AUP will seriously consider some of these principles, and we hope we'll be able to work with our students to improve upon these principles. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan and Claudia. Thanks so much. Let's come back to the room, and maybe I will ask people if you'll turn your cameras on. It's really hard to have a conversation when people have their cameras off. But I would love to hear, I didn't actually look to see if there was anything in the chat. I don't think so. So maybe you'll turn your cameras on and we'll just sort of invite you into an informal discussion, because this is really about our lives as teachers and students in the university. And we'd love to hear from some of these students who have been listening through the entire semester, but who are also living through this experience with Claudia and Susan, and who probably have a lot to say about this. So I thought I saw Jackson's hand up, did I? I thought so. Anyway.
Sorry, no, I was clapping, but I actually do have a question. So about toggling, I found that really interesting last year. Could you go more in depth about like what it truly means to be able to like toggle between oral and digital and written and kind of how are they, what are like the applications of it used in like the real world, like after university, like how do we?
So actually, Claudia, I'd like to take this. So toggling. So when you go into a job interview, Jackson, your oral skills are of real prominence, of real importance. You might, in order to have gotten to the interview stage, have had to write a cover letter. Most cover letters are absolutely awful. And consequently, at AUP, we work very closely with you through career services, for example, and your professors will read your cover letters to make sure that you demonstrate that you've mastered the written tradition. The digital tradition, everyone assumes that you're all digital natives and that you know everything there is to know about technology, but do you know about the ethics of technology? Do you understand how to make choices between different types of technology? What choice would be best for a different situation? And what we'd like to do is be able to provide our students with the confidence. Many students who are very good on social media hate to speak in class. They're terrified. We would like our students to be absolutely at ease in all three traditions, move between them seamlessly so that when they go into their job interview, they go in with confidence.
Alicia.
Yeah, sorry I don't have my camera on. Dr. Perry and Dr. Roda know I babysit during this time. I babysit a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old, so it's not really easy to leave them to their own devices. But I was really interested in the part about new reading. I've never heard of that, and it sounds equally fascinating and absolutely horrifying. So I would love if you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Claudia.
I didn't quite understand about the new
personalized reading that adapts to
the book that changes according to the reader.
Okay, actually, we did a study a few years ago with students, and we tried to see what the difference is between reading on paper and reading on a tablet, for example, and what sort of things you can learn better on a tablet or on paper. And we had some really interesting results, because what we found, so first of all, we thought that the fact that the for example, the size is adaptable, you can search, you can highlight on the tablet, that would have been much more adapted to let's say scientific readings, or something that it's that is not a novel. And first of all, we found, so the way that the experiment worked was that we gave exactly the same tasks, so something to read on paper, something to read on a tablet, and then we asked some questions to people to see how much they retained, and then we interviewed them and so on. This was a class project, and we found that it was exactly the opposite of what we were thinking. First of all, that in case if it was better, it would have been better on the fiction side rather than the technical side. And in any case, the performance was much better on paper in both cases. So we published an article. Actually, we took it to a conference that was all about online reading, and many other people found exactly the same. So there is something which at that time, I don't know if more recently has been defined, but at that time we couldn't point to what exactly was, but we work differently when we work online, and in general we are better. And there are a few things that you can imagine, right? When you read a book that is physical, you can tell immediately how big it is, and you can remember more or less, where was it open when I saw that thing that was interesting? Was it at the top of the page or at the bottom of the page? There are these things that we are used to do and we are very good at doing, and you completely lose that information when the book shapes in different ways, right, and adapts in different ways. Just in terms of display, imagine if the book changes in terms of content. That's all another layer, right? For example, if the content is adapted to you, whether you speak a language or another, whether you have a higher level of education or you're not very well educated, there are all these possibilities right now. And so it's very, we're a bit worried on a shift that is being very quick to online without really an understanding of what goes on in our brain when we read and learn from books.
Mm-hmm. And I'd just like to add, so if you have an almost AI-free classroom, you wouldn't use these books. Everybody would read the same book and they'd probably read it in paper, even if they had it on Kindle. The assumption would be they would be reading it on paper because they would read it better. Also, what we suspect will happen is that it's AI that will determine the content that you read, which means that the biases, the AI will be also tracking your eye movement as you read. Possibly in China, they're looking at, they're checking children's pulses while they read, heartbeat while they read, to determine how they respond to different sections. And so the human being becomes an object rather than a human, an object for consumption. So as you can imagine, we're going to talk about it actually, Alicia, in class on Tuesday. As you can imagine, it is undesirable for a liberal arts institution to engage in this type of new reading.
Thank you.
Madison, well, I don't know who was first there. Was that Rachel or Madison?
Rachel.
Rachel.
Hello. First of all, I just want to say thank you, Professor Roda and Professor Perry, for an amazing, loss of attention right there, for an amazing presentation. It was more of a comment, slightly a question. So a lot of us are reading online at this point. Do you think it's also because of a push to be more environmentally friendly and conscious and not use as much paper?
Oh no, use paper, Rachel, use paper. It's more environmentally friendly than electricity.
So yeah, it's really interesting because the question of the not printing to save the planet has never been, or as far as I know, maybe there are studies, but I haven't seen them, and I've been looking, and I'm sure Susan Perry also did the same. So how much memory do we use now so that we don't print, and how much does it cost to store all this information electronically, and how much does it cost to display it on video and to keep your video on, your screen on while you read it? So there is a question of energy consumption, and now that we have all these problems with specific materials and the way in which we get this material that we need to build our computers, that we keep throwing out, by the way, and getting a new one because they are designed so that they won't last to the next generation of operating systems. So there is this question that is never really addressed and is quite important. So yes, I mean, it's not an easy answer. It's, you know, we want to do the right thing. How do we do the right thing very much often depends on what we are told. And as you know, what we are told needs to be looked at from many different points of view.
So the best response is to use a secondhand book. And then you've probably hit all notes.
Madison.
Thank you, Rachel.
Hi, I was just wondering, I think about, I don't know exactly where the question is in this, but the impact of technology in the classroom on professors, because I think a lot of the liberal arts value is like interaction between professors and students, and like the ways in which now technology is so entrenched and like there's almost no way to communicate sometimes with your professor without going through technology, or like a lesson without technology. And so I was curious if you guys had thoughts on that interaction.
Claudia, we should abandon technology in the classroom. Let's just abandon it. We'll turn on the lights, and that's the last piece of technology we'll use.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are all good questions, and think these are really important reflections. So I'd be happy to leave the technology out of the classroom. I'm sure you were thinking more of the communication outside of the classroom, right? Because we don't use that much technology apart from the PowerPoint that we can certainly do without. But I think the communication outside of the classroom is important, and this is part of the social pressure that I mentioned before, is the fact that we have become increasingly dependent on this technology. Yeah. And we don't even realize that, I mean, it would take, well, few hours to break all this down. You just take down the electricity, we lose all this. And do we have a backup? I mean, as Susan was saying before, our president was great in preparing us to the transition to the use of technology when we needed it. I don't think there is anybody in the world who is prepared to the transition to the not use of technology when we will need it, and will come the time when, you know, a virus will break the internet, the electricity will go, whatever, something will happen, and we will need to be able to function without the technology. I don't think anybody is really prepared for that.
No, some of us have a memory of that, but
why would you? I mean, I was very convinced by what you said about toggling back and forth between oral, written, and digital. And there might even be other valences in there. And of course, it's easy for us to all see the oral and the written as really central to the liberal arts. But frankly, I can also see moments where the digital, let's just take an example of a music course where a teacher wanted to use YouTube performances to go through and show students, here's what an interpretation of Bach sounds like here. And here's what it sounds like when it's done chorally. And here's what it done, you know, I mean, I just can't imagine how you could possibly do that without the digital. There are so many examples now today where you can make, and it might deal with that fragmented attention stuff too, because you can keep students' attention better if you can have in-depth visual and auditory examples like that for students. So I think we have to be open to the idea that these digital tools can sometimes do things better than having a teacher put a vinyl on and hunt around for the right track. And you know what I mean? You don't want to throw that baby out with the bathwater.
It's definitely the case. It's definitely the case. I mean, we're definitely not saying that we shouldn't use technology in the classroom.
No, we joke about it, but we use it.
But no, but I think the important question is, are we capable of taking a step back and see where technology is really useful and where we're just using it because that's what everybody does? And are we capable of thinking of what would happen if we didn't have the technology, even if for just a short amount of time, right? So definitely we use technology. Here we are, right? We wouldn't be able to do this without the technology, and technology will be there. I think what we are trying to argue is that there are many aspects that we need to look at in a perhaps more critical way to see what we are really doing when we use the technology.
Madison, do you know how professors and students communicated before email? Can you imagine?
I don't, my guess is they didn't, which I don't necessarily think is bad. Well, not as much though, right? Like office
certainly
hours.
not as much.
You went to office hours and you waited in line for really long amounts of time.
Or you wrote a note and you put it in the faculty mailbox and you received a written response in return. So it was different. Thank you.
Amelia, you got your hand up.
Oh, yes. And thank you so much for this wonderful talk today. The current relationship between liberal arts and technology reminds me of a quote from Kierkegaard: "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards." How do we suffer the implications of error in this delicate situation without existentially threatening the integrity of the liberal arts education? Human rights are often implemented retroactively. So how exactly do we ensure thorough human oversight in the classroom?
Okay, that's a great question. I'm going to start with this, Claudia, because the human rights piece of it. So we say that human rights are implemented retroactively. No, violators are pursued retroactively, but human rights are actually supposed to be implemented, as Kierkegaard said, living forward. And what we're trying to do with our work on technology is to convince all of the players who are drafting laws and promulgating them to actually integrate the human rights into the legislation so that our relationship with technology functions within a human rights framework going forward, rather than taking a torts approach where you go backwards and after the wrong has been committed, you run to court, you sue somebody, etc. And it's hard work. Torts is easier. It's in the future, so nobody has to worry about it, right? And the error may not occur. So, and I very much agree with Professor Roda that we need to think of how we can live without technology, and we actually need to be running what I would call parallel courses. Parts of your day need to be invested in living with no technology whatsoever, investing in very robust human to human or human to nature interaction, human to reading with a paper book that's secondhand, Rachel, interaction. And then part of the day can be used for technology. The key, as far as I'm concerned personally, is that to have a very rich life with really highly developed flow thinking, analytical flow thinking, you need to have a ratio where probably only a third of your day interacts with technology and the other 2/3, I'm talking about while you're awake, is involved in activities that don't integrate technology. That's hard to do. It actually requires quite a lot of mindfulness, but you'll find that your creativity will expand exponentially if you engage in that. Anyway, Claudia, you might have something to add here.
No, that's fine. We can take the next question.
Okay.
You covered it
Part
all.
of the problem is how addictive those technologies are and how
They're
dependent
designed to be.
upon them we get. You know, we're so used to being able to look up something, a fact that we need to know. So that whole notion of absorbing facts and absorbing knowledge and being tested on it is really a thing of the past at this point, because everybody can have access to. So the scary thing, I mean, I'm looking at Marie-Clémence's question up there. What about the side effects to one's health when having Wi-Fi on all the time, reading in tablets and stuff like that? That goes with that idea of addiction, okay? Of being addicted to
you may or may not know, we're working right now on an article, Claudia and I, with 2 AUP students who have graduated on the shift. Breast cancer has now become the most significant cancer for all humans worldwide, even though it has gently been dropping, and in some cases dropped precipitously because testing has increased in certain countries. And this movement towards the first rank position for breast cancer is accompanying the rise in electromagnetic wave pollution, the electromagnetic waves that are used to transmit wireless information. And we want more research to be done. We want to understand the impact on our health. We want to know if there's a gender component in all of this. If women, for whatever reason, because of the way breast tissue functions, are absorbing more of these electromagnetic waves than men, for example. And none of this research, it's occurring in the laboratory, but it's not occurring outside of the laboratory, so we just don't know. And so Marie-Clémence is absolutely right. It is probably a large public health issue that we just are unwilling to address because there are so many jobs on the line, there is so much money on the line, and the ability of countries to be players on the global stage depends on the mastery of technology. And so it's going to be very difficult. It took a long time to get smoking curtailed, if you will, or to put seatbelts in cars. And it's going to take a long time for this as well. Thank you, Marie-Clémence.
I think Leanne has a question.
Hello. Well, thank you very much for this conference. I have learned so much. I'm even on the daycare with waiting to pick up my baby, and I haven't been able because I'm so fixed in what you're saying. So I had a comment about the recycling of e-waste. I teach environmental science at AUP. I haven't found any paper saying that it's more eco-friendly to use online reading than paper reading. I don't know if it existed, but I haven't found it. What I do know is that e-waste, so everything that comes from computer and so on, is very difficult to recycle. There are even pieces that we haven't been able to recycle at all. And in other way, we also have to think on how electricity is produced. And in countries like France, we produce it by nuclear power. And that we know, recycling nuclear power is very difficult. I mean, we're talking about so many years that takes the process of recycling the waste of nuclear power that is almost impossible to compare with paper. However, paper technology, we master it very well, and we know how to recycle. Actually, we can recycle paper at home. So if we don't need to print it.
Oops, we lost you. We've lost you. There we go.
It was my telephone that was ringing. So if we could recycle paper at home, that's what I was saying. If we need to read a novel from a book that has the content that can last, I really advise it to read it on paper. Just an email, printing an email doesn't have any sense. So probably we really have to think not on printing, non-printing, but what do we print and why? That's what I needed to say regarding the recycling or the eco-friendly politics about printing. Now, my questions to you is that I want to understand this attention fragmentation thing. Do we have any biological explanation for this? Well, I would like to know that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudia.
Oh, that's a big question, but just to give you a quick answers. So we know for sure that we function much better when we don't fragment our attention. We also know that we fragment our attention. We've been fragmenting our attention well before computers came about. And the problem of attention fragmentation has always been a problem. So the big question is really how, in which way the digital technology is actually making this a much bigger problem. And here there are many theories, because and I can give you my own personal view after seeing cognitive science theory, social theory, all sorts of theories. I think it's a convergence of several things. First of all, the way in which we communicate through machine doesn't respect the code of human-to-human communication. So for example, when we talk to each other, we don't just go and change the subject suddenly, or if two people are talking, we don't interrupt them, or if we see that someone's attention is away, we do something to recover the attention before we say something, or we stop saying something because we saw that we lost someone's attention. All this is completely gone. I mean, when you have messages coming to you, SMSs, email, and so on, it's as if you were if you had several different conversations going on at the same time, and you completely lose this, they're called the maximum of communication, of how you take how you go about conversing with people. I tend to say that our computers and devices are like 2-year-old kids who haven't learned yet how to communicate. It's when you tell them, shut up, don't you see that someone else is talking, right? It's exactly the same thing. And then there is a second thing, is that the digital communication has embedded social demands. So we know we are expected to respond. And if we don't respond, right, we are not giving our attention, and by not giving our attention, we may not get the attention back. Okay, so all this, there are several things that play together that makes it so that although a big forest is give us much more stimuli than what we normally could take, and there our attention can certainly be fragmented. In the digital environment, there are other pressures that come into play, and we have probably the same order of magnitude in terms of signals, but it's much more difficult to manage. I hope I explained it. It's a bit complex, but
thank you, Leanne, and hello to all of the children who are in the background there. They look like they're having a great time.
I just want to say one thing that about technology. I couldn't ever add the career that I've had, if it wasn't for technology. And as we can see, most women here are able to attend the conference where they're looking after kids. And this is the way, if you like, in this sense, technology has made a huge change for women. And so definitely we need to recognize that and to understand how we can keep having harness the advantages of technology while making sure we respect all the other human dignity.
We got anybody else who would like to make a comment or ask a question of our speakers? Serenity just added something. We've discussed a little bit discrimination from technology or AI, but I wonder how you would compare that to the discrimination that previously existed in education, for example, from the SAT or prejudiced teachers. Is one more detrimental or controllable than the other? It's a great question.
It's a great question, Claudia. Before you answer that, I'm just going to say that from my point of view, technology accelerates discrimination because it accelerates most activities. And also, it's far more difficult to accuse a machine of racism or sexism than it is another human because of the way humans interact with one another. And so it's a problem of a new magnitude in a sense. And I think Claudia can speak to the biases in algorithms, for example. What I'm nervous about is that we won't invest the resources, Serenity, to rein in the biases of algorithms. We won't have enough women and people of color in STEM fields to be able to write the algorithms that will be so that they'll be more balanced. Because of privacy protections in Europe, a lot of data sets that are now available, for example, in the healthcare center, come from places like China. And what does that say about European health? Is it compatible? And so consequently, it's not being managed at all for the moment. And Claudia, you might have more to speak to on that.
Well, to me, this is a really interesting problem because so the standard reason that is given to use basically scoring system. This is the most like in the risk assessment for criminal justice, or the definition of who gets a certain grade rather than another one, who gets into a school rather than another one, who gets help from the state or not. The reason why we bring in machines, and this is the standard reason, is that people are biased, and so we need to do something which is more rational and which is based on facts. The fact what I was talking at the beginning of this talk. So, but the fact that we put into the machine is some people putting those facts in the machine. So what they do, they put their bias into the algorithm. And at that point, the algorithm is defined unbiased. And so it's much harder to
contest.
Yeah, to contest. And actually what we do, we reinforce biases. People, one thing we do as human beings, we have regrets. We feel guilty.
Shame. We feel shame.
Bad. We feel shame if we make a wrong judgment. The machine doesn't, so it keeps just going, right? And it will just reinforce that bias. So unless we have human oversight, and unless we have teams of developers that, first of all, are built of different people, different genders, different race, and so on, but also that feel the responsibility that they have when they design those algorithms. I think we just go against the wall thinking that we're doing something beautiful, and we don't.
It's a great question, Serenity. Thank you.
I'm so glad you raised this issue today of technology and AI. Sometimes I feel like we kind of run them together a little bit, and I need to understand better what it means to use AI in the classroom as opposed to what it means just to use technology and technology tools. But in any case, I think it was time that we sort of brought this whole discussion around to education, and I thank both of you for this wonderful thing, and particularly for the recommendations that you ended on. We got a lot of vague gesturing or feelings of frustration from some former interveners in this series without some clear guidelines for how we put those guide rails in. So I really do applaud the fact that you ended your talk with 5 very good ones, institutable ones, fully understandable ones that come out of your research. And I also want to tell you guys, we're going to take a little break on the series for the next couple of weeks, but we're going to come back for 2 more. On April 20th, we're going to hear from David Wright, the Director of Trilateral Research, which provides research, data protection, and platform services to universities, law enforcement authorities, hospitals, and government agencies. So I think that talk will come really quite beautifully out of Professor Roda's and Professor Perry's. And he's going to speak to us about the ethics of technological self-defense. And then our last lecture will be a week later, April 27th at 5 o'clock. And we're going to hear from a friend of Seth Farbman, who began this series, the CMO of Spotify. He's going to introduce us. He's going to bring to this series a friend of his who's a tech futurist to, I think, really scare us all to death and make us start doing all the recommendations that Susan and Claudia have laid out for us tonight. Thank you to all the students and also to Susan Pure, who's a former professor of AUP. Good to see you, Susan, and to Leon Selig, who's also on the line in California this morning, a former trustee of AUP. We're really happy to have you on board and with us here. Susan is a biologist, and Leon is particularly interested in technology. And looking forward to seeing you all on the 20th. Thank you, both of you, my colleagues, for such a terrific intervention.
And thank you,
Celeste. Thank you very much. Thank you, Celeste.
Bye.